This is how I made the cape for my Hornet cosplay. I made a couple different ones for orders and I think I got my method down pretty well. So this video will handle all the materials and the methods I used to get this nice wavy effect. It was also important to me that the cape was wrinkle-free, smooth and seamless. The materials I used for this cape is mainly scuba fabric or neoprene fabric. This is the red neoprene scuba fabric from Big Z Fabric. This piece of fabric was 58 by 58 inches wide in length. The next important ingredient is plastic corset boning. I used 1/2 inch plastic cornet boning and I needed at least 5 yards. This covers the entire edge of the cape. Then I needed some small bits like fusible hem tape and I needed something rigid for the collar to stand up. For this I used a stiff piece of felt from Hobby Lobby. Make sure that it is stiff felt and not the floppy kind. And you can also use EVA foam or other rigid material, such as interfacing. I also made a pattern for my collar. I'll link this in the description below so you can download the same color pattern. You also need a couple tools, such as a sewing machine, an iron, and a hole punch or sharp awl or some other sharp punch tool to get through the plastic boning. I'm starting with the square piece of fabric here. I fold it over 2 times and then also fold it over diagonally. This makes it very easy to cut out the round shape I need for my cape. Then use a measure tape to measure the shortest side of the triangle, with the point being the neck of the cape. Transfer it to the longest side and mark it. And then use this measurement to draw out a half circle that will make up the rest of the cape. I mark it in a few spots, I don't draw the entire line. I use my fabric scissors to cut through and make the circle for the cape. If the stack of fabric is too thick, I just cut it in layers. It's most important that it is smooth, but it doesn't need to be perfectly circular. You're not going to see a perfect circle in the end result anyway. Make sure you save the corners that you cut off. This makes the color lighter. Then it's time to cut out the neck hole, which is going to be in the center of the circle. I used my pattern for the neck collar to kind of estimate how big the neck hole needs to be. Because this fabric is very stretchy, you don't want to cut it too big. So start with about 2 inches to 2.5 inches and cut off the corner for the cape. Now that the cape is cut, we can cut out all our pieces for our collar. I traced it on my piece of felt, which is perfectly big enough to trace out 2 pieces for the collar. This will make up 2 halves of the collar. The stiff felt will be the center layer of the collar and will be used to keep the collar upright. This was cut out without seam allowance, directly transferred from the pattern. The cut corners from the square piece of fabric to make the circle cape is perfectly sized to make the collar for the cape. I fit the pattern to the corners and make sure that there's some excess fabric for the seam allowance. I traced my pattern and cut it out with the seam allowance included. I ended up tracing my felt pieces because they were a little bit easier to trace with the thicker edge. Now all the pieces for the collar are cut. You'll end up with 6 pieces for the collar. 1 for the inside, 1 for the center structure, the felt, and 1 for the outside. To use the plastic boning for the edge, you can see here how I'm using it as like a kind of a bridge to make little circles. This will go into the hem of the cape. I used to cut this into pieces, but now I sew it in one single piece and fold it afterwards, so you don't have to cut it into pieces. The entire length of the boning is sewn to the hem of the cape with a straight stitch. This doesn't need to be very neat and it doesn't have to be pinned on. actually sew in more fabric than you do plastic boning. This is important because we're folding over the hem twice, which reduces the diameter of the cape. If you push a little bit extra fabric for each stitch, the hem will not flip over later. And it will make weird curls if it does. Double stitch over the end of the boning and snip it off. Then the circle cape will look like this. Now we can actually make the scalloped edge. We're folding over the hem twice so that the boning is hidden inside the hem. This is going to be the inside of the cape. So with the inside of the cape facing up, I'm folding over the hem twice and then pinching it. The plastic boning will fold and stay in that shape once it's pinched. I made about 12 folds this way, opposite of each other, like a clock. By keeping it opposite and equally distributed, I don't have to measure anything and it's simply pinned in place before I fasten everything. This is how the inside of the cape will look like with all the insides clamped. Now I'm going to permanently fasten these folds. To do that, I'm poking a hole through the plastic boning in the edge of the folds. And then I'm going to stitch through it like a button. This needs to be done by hand because usually the double layered plastic boning is a little bit too tough for any sewing machine to take. And you're only going to tack it into one place, like a button. Use some doubled up red thread or some upholstery thread to make it nice and strong. Once you looped it a couple times, tie it off and snip it and move to the next fold. Once you're done with each fold, it should look like this. I'm actually not sewing the rest of the hem because it will stay in place just nice. I usually iron the hem in place a little bit with an iron to make sure that it stays in place, but just to make it more flat really. Make sure that the heat is good enough for the scuba fabric because it is plastic fabric, so it can overheat quite quickly. That's why I'm ironing on the inside of the hem as well. I actually don't use any hem tape or any extra stitches or blind stitches in this fabric because if you use hem tape or glue, it will actually flatten the scuba fabric, which leaves spots and dents that you don't want. Thankfully the folds will keep it in place just nicely. Now to move on to the collar. I pinned together the inside and the outside lining and sew them together at the ends because we're going to put the felt interfacing in there. I only sew over the lines that I marked and not over the seam allowance. I trim off the corners because it would add a lot of bulk to the seam if I leave the corners there. So all the corners get snapped off diagonally to the corner that I sew. Now I have two circles, one for the inside and the outside. To sew the felt together, I overlap them slightly and use a zigzag stitch to stitch it together. This is a little bit more stronger and flatter than if you would sew them side to side. Now it's time for some hem tape to make sure that this seam allowance on the scuba fabric lays down flat. The scuba fabric doesn't really lay down flat without hem tape. So this is a way to ensure that the seam will lay nice and flat and not visible from the outside. I pressed pretty hard and I used an extra cloth to make sure that it doesn't really touch the outside, because I don't want to melt my fabric or make any dents for the outside if I heat it up too high. I repeat this for all other corners. The inside lining and the outside lining of the collar are pinned together so I can sew them together. I make sure that my seams line up nicely so it looks better. And then I'm pinning the rest of the outside of the collar. Here I'm sewing the outside of the wrong side of the colors together. Again, the seam allowance on this fabric is very bulky, so I'm going to trim off one side of the seam allowance only, making sure to trim as close to the seam as possible. You can use applique scissors for this as well. Just make sure that you don't actually cut the seam, and if you do, just sew over it again for a little stitch. Now I want to attach my felt collar to the inside of the collar. The cleanest way for me to do this without using any glue or interfacing that might dent the scuba fabric is by sewing the edges of the collar to the seam allowance on the inside of the lining. Here I'm pinning it together, making sure that the felt collar doesn't overlap the actual seam. I also make sure that the places where I stitch the felt collar together do not perfectly overlap with the same seam allowance on the lining of the collar, because it would add extra bulk if I had to do those double. I just make sure that they fit just next to the side to it to make the transition smoother. I removed the table from my sewing machine so I can sew it on like a sleeve. I'm just sewing this on with a simple straight stitch. I don't need to be super smooth about this seam because it's going to be hidden inside the collar. Then when I turn it inside out, I have the felt interfacing perfectly situated inside the collar. To lay the seam extra flat, I also top stitch the seam allowance on the outside of the collar. This seam will only be visible on the inside of the collar, but it will make the seam lay a bit more flat because ironing is not only gonna work so much on this fabric. Then I'm determining the area where I want my collar to attach to my cape. I just want it to sit a little bit below the felt interfacing without having to stitch over the felt interfacing itself. So I'm pinning where the felt interfacing ends on the inside of my collar. And make sure that everything is distributed nicely without too many folds. Then I take the neck of my cape and pin it to the outside of the collar. I do not pin the inside of the collar or the felt interfacing in the collar, just the outside of the cape and the outside of the collar together. This will make up our neck seam. Again, make sure that everything is nicely uniformly distributed and fits nicely. Because this is a fairly stretchy fabric, you can play around a lot with the seams and make sure that there's no extra folds in your seam. Now I can stitch the neck collar to my cape. I didn't mark it here, but I should be following the line that I marked for my actual collar pattern. Making sure that I not sew the inside lining or the felt interfacing. Now the outside of the collar and the cape are stitched together, but the inside lining is still loose. I'm trimming off the seam allowance that sits in the middle, which is the outside of the collar. Again, I try to trim as close to the seam as possible. Then, to close up the collar, I want to stitch the seam allowance to the seam. So I'm sticking the cape seam allowance inside the collar, and the collar seam allowance goes over that, and then gets stitched to the seam that keeps the collar and the cape together. I'm going to stitch this in the ditch, so you cannot see any seam on the outside of the cape, but you still get the strength of two seam allowance that overlap each other. I'm going to pin it in place, and so I can make sure that I'm stitching in the right side and not miss any seam allowance. Again, I'm using my sewing machine without the table attached, so I can sew it on like a sleeve. Do this step very slowly and meticulously, so you make sure that you stitch perfectly in the center of the seam. And also make sure that your pin direction is correct, because that saves you a lot of work trying to remove pins while sewing, if you spin it in the right direction. By stitching it in the ditch, I am not going to see any seam on the outside, but I'm still getting the strength of two seam allowances that overlap. Now the lining of the collar is stitched to the seam. There's a raw edge here that you can trim or serge or do any kind of finishing on, but it should be pretty much done now. What I did was trimming the seam, raw seam a little bit, and then zigzag stitching it, giving it a little bit of an overlap or surger appearance. I didn't have any red thread for my surger, and I didn't want to re-thread my surger with just red thread to finish this off, so that's why I used the zigzag stitch on my sewing machine instead. And that should be the cape completed.